This week, I'm thinking a lot about Haruki Murakami, not only because he's got a new book out that I just finished reading, but also because there's a new translation of my favorite work of his, which is Hard-Boiled Wonderland and the End of the World. Now, this was initially translated in the early 90s, and a lot of it was excised. I'd say about 100 pages based on what I've been able to ascertain. But this new translation, which is out from Everyman's Library here in the US and Vintage in the UK, brings back a lot of probably extraneous material and probably stuff that's not that vital to the plot, but I can't say for sure. It could just be a lot of spaghetti making and cat ruminations and jazz thoughts, but you know, I love Murakami. These are things that I want more of. So I'm looking forward to getting the hardcover edition of this in the next few hours. It should be getting delivered as soon as the postman shows up. So yes, excited for that. Secondly, I am also thinking about The City and Its Uncertain Walls, the new Murakami novel that I just finished a few days ago. And I've got some thoughts about it. So let's dive in a little bit and talk about this new Murakami piece of work and see if it's worth your time to read whatsoever. By way of background, one thing that I think should be highlighted that has been a little misleading in some of the American marketing materials is this idea that The City and Its Uncertain Walls is a sequel to Hard-Boiled Wonderland and the End of the World. This was mentioned in the pre-release information for the book and has sort of kind of perpetuated itself as the go-to hook for why people are buying this book. Also, it's why I wanted to read it and was more excited about it than I have been about any more recent Murakami works. I will say that it is important you know that this is
Not a
not
sequel.
true. It is not a sequel in any way, shape, or form to Hard-Boiled Wonderland and the End of the World. I just want to set your expectations right now. So, by way of historical background, let's talk about why there is this tie between the two works. In 1980, Haruki Murakami wrote a novella called The City and Its Uncertain Walls. I would like to be able to tell you what that novella is in detail, but the truth of the matter is it has not been available since its initial publication. He was very unhappy with it, and he has basically disavowed its ever being able to be reprinted. Certainly not in English, not even in Japanese. It was one of his earliest works, and once he hit success through A Wild Sheep Chase, he decided, no, I'm going to improve this idea because it's very flawed, and I was very green as a writer at the time. So he initially revisited it by tying this fantastical idea of a walled-in city where people don't have shadows and there's unicorns everywhere and there's guardsmen who don't allow shadows inside the city. He tied that in with sort of a espionage, science fiction, kind of cyberpunky, almost Inception-y sort of concept that eventually became the book Hard-Boiled Wonderland and the End of the World. But 30 years later, he felt it was important to revisit that material again because he still felt like it was this hanging sort of Damocles that he needed to cut down, I guess you could say. So he revisited it once again, and during the pandemic developed this novel that's available to us now, also called The City and Its Uncertain Walls. So I must again emphasize, they are not sequels. They are retellings of the same concept in different stories. The best example I can give just off the top of my head would be like, what if I wrote a story about a three-legged dog and decided to tie in that three-legged dog in with an adventure about aliens in the first book and then decided, no, you know what? I'm going to do another story about a three-legged dog and a slice of life tale. They're not the same book. They just happen to have two similar ideas at their core. And that's the case with this. It just happens to be that similar ideas are something that's very highly fantastical and kind of bizarre. But that's how Murakami world works, baby. What do you want me to say? All right, Kyle, we get it. They're not connected in any way. Just tell us what the book's about. Yes, Thanks, Other Kyle. All right, let's talk about the plot of The City and Its Uncertain Walls. So this novel is made up of 3 distinct sections that all center on the journey of the same unnamed protagonist. The first chunk of the book is probably what people who are coming in thinking there's going to be some connection to Hard-Boiled Wonderland and the end of the world. It's what they're probably expecting, and something that is probably the best sort of ease into the overall story and structure of this book. It has alternating chapters that alternate between this love story between the protagonist and his sort of high school sweetheart. They're like these long distance pen pals after they meet at a ceremony. And they have kind of a very deep and intriguing connection between one another that causes them to write back and forth, and he becomes very emotionally attached. And it alternates between that and chapters where he's in his 40s and he's in this titular city, and the experience of him severing his own shadow to go into the city, and he ends up meeting the teenage version of the same paramour that he had been having this long distance relationship with in the other chapters. And these chapters kind of duck and weave between one another until you finally understand the sort of time frame in which they connect with one another, which sees the protagonist one day waking up in the city when he's in his 40s. I will say that this first part of the book I struggled with because it felt very familiar, which is funny to say for something that I was expecting to be a sequel to a book that I love. But the truth of the matter is it felt very recycled. And I guess by virtue of its creation, that recyclability makes some sense. And it's been about a decade since I've read Hard-Boiled Wonderland. So I was hoping that no matter how reheated a lot of this material might have felt, I was coming in with fresh eyes regardless. But even with that 10-year gap between reading this book and then reading this one, I still felt a lot of redundancy, a lot of been there, done that, especially in its more fantastical sections. And the romance part, I don't know, it just seemed undercooked, honestly. Like, there's a lot of sort of Norwegian Wood DNA here, especially in how Murakami can still kind of deftly handle the longing of teenage sweethearts, but there's also sort of a lack of believability in this idea that like, this guy that's 40 is still in love with this girl that he was writing letters to when he was 17 that just ghosted him. You know, like there's something that just kind of screams, man, get therapy, if that's the case. But I've also kind of come to accept that while there are many sort of deep ruminations and very profound insights in Murakami's work about life, and I think this book particularly has a interesting sort of snapshot into into the idea of the midlife crisis, which is something that I don't know that he's touched on too much in his work, even as a man who's like approaching 80 or at 80. This is kind of the first work of his that I think is dealing with someone at their midlife point. I still sort of felt like this idea of a simplified, very pure romance is really just part and parcel with his work, and just the kind of thing that I've had to come to expect, even if every once in a while I kind of hope for a little bit more, especially at the twilight of his career. Now, when we get to the second section, though, I think things really liven up, and it became the point in which I became very interested in the book. This really actually stretches back to the very tail end of the first section of the book that has, I think, a very compelling relationship between the protagonist and his shadow. I think it's probably the most touching relationship in the book. But the story and narrative kind of carries over into that second section, which sees him back in the real world after his sojourn into the city, the unnamed city. He decides to sort of cast aside his current career as a book distributor, and he wants to become a librarian because that's what he was doing more or less in the unnamed city. And so he goes out into this country library where he applies for a job. He meets a very colorful, small cast of characters, including the previous head of the library, who I think is probably the best drawn character of the book. And I think this kind of simplified life storytelling that I think really just dives into where he goes from here. He has this kind of this fantastical experience, but then what? I think that is the part of the book that is at its absolute richest, and where I felt like this is where Murakami had something new to say. And I think it was a beautiful expansion on something that was saving the stuff that I felt kind of redundant about towards the beginning. But then, at about the halfway point in the book, a character is introduced who is called Yellow Submarine Boy. This character is called that because he wears a parka with yellow submarine characters from the old Beatles film and album. I think the kindest way I can put this is that you get a lot of Rain Man atmosphere from it. He's a character who's on the spectrum. He might be autistic. The book doesn't really dive too much into this, other than to say he has savant syndrome. I generally don't get too bothered by that, but even I, as somebody who's pretty hardened to this kind of stuff, felt like this was not the right thing, to say the least. He introduces this character who kind of takes over the focus of the plot. The protagonist is still the narrator, but all of his interest from the initial sort of burst of energy of that second section quickly shifts over to this guy, and he takes over all of the plot mechanisms. It drove me absolutely nuts, especially by the time the third section, which ties everything together and sends everyone back to the city and tries to wrap everything up in a bow, more or less. He becomes the plot driver that has all the answers. He has a lot of information that he should not have as a character who's brand new, yet somehow he has answers that not even the reader knows that he has. So I found that this was just like such a cheap cop-out, especially towards the end, where really nothing ties together particularly all that well, I didn't feel. And I still came away with a lot of questions around the resolution itself, what even happens to certain characters, and just where things end up at the end. It just kind of felt like he was rushing to the end to get to the end of the book, rather than giving the reader something that was satisfying in of itself. All in all, I found The City and Its Uncertain Walls to be a ambitious, if disappointing experience. I will say, by and large, it's probably the most disappointing read of the year for me. Not in the sense that it's the worst thing I read, but it's the thing I was most excited about, and it just didn't live up to my own expectations. Overall, I would give it 2.5 stars. Yeah, I know. It bums me out too, but I start to wonder if those articles about Murakami losing the sauce are correct. I hope I'm wrong and the next book wins me back, but this just felt like exercising demons that really didn't need to be exercised. And if you want to read about these this particular concept, just stick with one of his early masterpieces rather than jumping into the new thing, because it's just not worth the squeeze. Okay, so that's my thoughts on The City and Its Uncertain Walls. You probably wonder what I'm reading next. We'll see if I have any thoughts about that in time for the Christmas season. I might do a tier ranking too about all the books I've read this year as well. So anyway, we'll get back to you, and everybody have a nice mid-December. Hope you're staying warm.